I'm stuck with. In any case, natural gas up on a compound growth rate of about 4% over the interval as share of generation. Renewables up on a 12% compound growth rate over the interval. Pretty massive growth. What you end up with is also about a 2.7% decarbonization to the downside compound decline over the interval. So a pretty big deal. That decarbonization arguably didn't stem entirely from the decarbonization policies, not even mostly from the decarbonization policies of the era that I've defined as the decarbonization era. Part of them came from things like the mercury and air toxic standards, which had the effect of retiring coal plants that were uneconomic to retrofit. Some of them came, of course, from the renewables expansion. And quite frankly, a lot of it came from the fundamental low cost of natural gas from horizontally drilled, hydraulically fractured wells. On a sector basis, transportation is now a bigger emitter as part of the economy than electricity, which is a pretty big change. The overall carbon intensity of the US economy is down quite a lot. And if you think about transportation over the full 15 years I've given you, it's kind of unfair because it peaks on an emissions basis in 07, the peak consumption goes down, comes back up, but the fact that it's basically flat, you're looking at a 15-year compound growth of 0.03, basically reflects efficiency gains in transportation as well. That sector also decarbonizing. So scorecard, did the decarbonization era work? Yes, but not actually because of the decarbonization policies of that era, more really from some of the ones that preceded it. Which brings me to deregulation. This is a different president with the energy policy tool of scissors, cutting the ribbon that shows the trend line and regulatory burden in the Office of Management and Budget. This is also an area where oversimplification makes it easy to give a presentation, but lends itself to some distortion. There are two basic kinds of deregulation I'll present. The rip it up, where you simply get rid of the rule, rescind it. It is not there, it's politically popular, you can say at rallies, I ripped up this, I ripped up that. Ripping things up sells. And the write it again, the wonkish restructuring around a narrower set of parameters, more appealing to industry, that provides sort of a regulatory stability that can endure. A differently disposed future administration can replace the void left by ripping things up with their own right again, or right anew even, which can be much greener and much more restrictive. So as it turns out, the Trump administration, for all of the rhetoric, has still mostly been in the business of writing things again. There's been some notable rippings up, but I would say that they're mostly focused on that less politically palatable. And frankly, if you think about it, to write a climate rule again means to acknowledge anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions contributing to climate change, and that is not the sort of thing that one sells at rallies necessarily, but it is the sort of thing that industry often celebrates for its regulatory stability. All of which brings me to my last D, if it is a D at all. Okay, dominance. Now, I probably should explain this. Now, you know what? I'll just go straight to LNG. That picture, ladies and gentlemen, was about LNG, which is the emblem of dominance. As it turns out, dominance was a word the president uttered in a May 2016 campaign speech in North Dakota, which appears to have been subsequently retrofitted with policy behind it, and a good one too, one that reflects a change in our circumstances. Produce more, move it to coasts, develop overseas markets. 3 steps. Produce more, move it to coasts, develop overseas markets. Okay, well, there are some challenges associated with dominance too. Melanie mentioned one of them, which is that if LNG has become the emblem of our dominance, it's also become the #1 target for those who want to try to pursue trade war against the United States. Hence today's 10% tariff against US LNG exports. Very meaningful, I think, to point to LNG. Refined products were the first to dominate, did so in 2011, moving into the market on a net export basis with the prolific output from US refineries. Crude oil is a long way from net exports, so gas is really more impressive in the notion that it was 6 decades in between the last net export interval and last year, when LNG, in conjunction with pipeline gas, helped to carry natural gas to dominance on the open seas. In any case, I've given you 5 Ds. They overlap, even blur, if you will. Some things blur more than others. And I would contend that from diversification to economic development to decarbonization to deregulation to dominance, we'll probably have plenty to, yes, it starts with D, discuss. Thank you.
15 minutes left, and I wanted this to be an interactive discussion. So I'll go ahead and open up the floor. I have plenty of questions I can ask, but if anyone would like to come up to the mic and ask a question. And please state your name and affiliation.
John Valentine, Brandeis University. I'd like you to talk about the state regulatory structure. Because implementing any of these policies that you're talking about, whether it be EPA, whether it be the utility regulations, rate structuring, and New England bringing down, hydro from Canada, turns out to be somewhat of a structure. So there's a real impediment in terms of the regulatory, in my opinion, a real impediment in terms of the state regulatory structure in moving forward with energy policies. And as you know, EPA is administered very differently under the Clean Water Act in different states. So if we just sort of talk about that issue on any of these issues.
Who's the question to?
I think it's to all of them.
Can you hear me? We're actually looking at California, doing some analysis of what they've done in California, and they just passed SB 100. SB 100 requires 100% carbon-free electricity by 2045. And 60% renewables. It's not, the others just zero emissions. I would look at that as a positive if you are an all of the above energy person, because there is room for other carbon-free electricity in that law. They have SB 236, which purports to be an economy-wide environmental goals, but it leaves out agriculture and industry, as near as I can gather looking at the law. They have a 5 million EV target by 2030 or something, all new buildings have to be electrified as opposed to have gas heat. Or gas cooking, and the Restaurant Association in California is not very happy because they like gas cooking, and so we do look at state regulations. I showed you the commitments up there, which are not necessarily regulatory commitments, although a lot of the states on there do have some legal and regulatory requirements for clean energy. And it's very complicated, and I suspect that some of those regulations work against each other, and that's one of the things that we will be looking at. But it's very complicated. My biggest concern is the Federal Power Act, which is federal legislation that makes it very difficult for us to, I believe, adequately address the cybersecurity issue and our electricity system. But we do look at state regulation all the time. I remain concerned about how these various states are going to meet their carbon targets and what that really means. And I'm not interested in cheerleading. I think that climate change is an extremely serious problem, and that we need to be rigorous. But right now, it's on a state-by-state basis, and only 22 states have really committed to it. So we look at them. It's complicated. Some of them are helpful. Renewable portfolio standards and have driven renewables markets in places like California, and so they are helpful in terms of clean energy. But I think that we need some federal laws to address some of these issues.
Yeah, just 2 points. One, I think it's an excellent question. I think Kevin's charts show why there have always been just differences among the states, priorities. So that's not new, but I would say it is more extreme now than it has ever been. And whether this is a passing matter because of the nature of our president and his views, or whether it reflects more fundamental demographic developments in terms of organization and the different priorities that the coasts have versus the Midwest. And I think particularly in the area of infrastructure, whether you're talking carbon policy or security, the inability to site pipelines or transmission lines is a great challenge. And whether you are, with wind folks, I mean, you can't get wind from where it is to the load without building transmission lines. But the states through which those lines transit say, I don't know, maybe better than not going to be built. I think hydropower in New Brunswick or in Canada is great, but if New Hampshire says you can't build a line and put it there, it's not going to be built. So I don't know what the answer is on that. I don't. It's going to be a challenge because it's something we'll muddle through. It's what we've done, but it'll definitely be a sort of economic conference, but a less effective solution. It could be a more costly solution. It could result in stranded investment because over time people will find a way to get to the most efficient solution on those. But I think Kevin's charts about sort of the resource bases that the states have, the perceptions overlaid with some very deep fundamental demographic trends are exaggerating these regional differences in ways that are making it really difficult for any coherent policy to be developed.
I would add just one other thing. I think that Lynn is right, the differences do seem more stark and probably do reflect a reaction to federal deregulatory policy by the greener states. We call it a rollback or rebound. And that brings me to sort of a second irony. In the same way that President Obama became the oil president, President Trump stands at risk of becoming the green president because of the rollback rebound, accelerating already in process greening.
Any other questions? Omar?
Hi, Omar Cabrales with FERC. Melanie, you mentioned the need to modernize the U.S. electric grid. What are in your opinion, the challenges and what is the political and public support, especially if we think about how much it would take to do it?
Well, let me count the ways. The modernization of the grid, let me back up. I'm providing advice on retail choice community aggregation policy in an unnamed state. And it's well, it could be Colorado, Connecticut, anyway, an unnamed state, and it's extremely difficult to get the kind of investment you need in the grid when you are disaggregating your grid. And I think that that's even causing a problem getting the kind of investment you need in large-scale storage. Because if you're disaggregating it, that's too expensive for small community aggregators to pay for. So it is problematic when you have those kinds of the distributed generation, all of the net metering debates. We want to sell our electricity back to the grid at retail rates and not pay for the existing system. And so valuation of that system is highly problematic. And I think I am skittish of vendor-driven policies. And I think that those could cause problems with the modernization of the grid. And so all I'm giving you are problems. And yes, but I didn't create them. I just analyzed them. And I think that we definitely need to be looking at infrastructure legislation. I think that the digital platforms need to be considered electricity infrastructure, for example. I mentioned the modernization of the substations and what needs to occur there. And I think that we need to think seriously about what constitutes investment in infrastructure, in energy infrastructure and electricity infrastructure, and kind of modernize our thinking on that as well. And but I would, Kevin, you have any thoughts about no?
Just saying, on this one, I'm a little more optimistic. I think there is a lot of grid modernization going on. And I don't think it's a problem to get capital investment. There's a problem with affordability in terms of what regulators will, and I can tell you, at Edison, the utility board I serve, is proposed a big grid modernization plan to the CPUC, because so much of the grid in California is regulated by the CPUC. But it is, most of that's going to be rejected on the basis of you're increasing rates on the distribution system, and we don't want that. We don't think that's necessary. So that has to get worked out. But in the meantime, there's a lot of hardening going on. There are new devices going in. I do think there's a lag, because there's a great reliability concern. There's a great sense that things have to work together. Are we going to build a lot more 765 or a lot for each direct DC lines like China's doing? No, I don't think that's going to happen in the U.S. I think it's jurisdictional. I think it's regional differences and environmental differences. It's not. We can't do that the way that China and other people do. I don't believe we have interconnections. But I do think there's a lot going on. I mean, if you just look at the industry numbers, there have been a lot of investments in hardening and situational awareness. Some of it's driven by cyber, some of it's driven by physical hardening. A lot of it's been driven by FERC requirements, whether it's GMD or supply chain, and so a lot of that's going to happen. But it's always the question of what will regulators allow and think is justified in customer rates. We've actually benefited from the lower cost of the energy itself, because I think that's what's enabled some of the investments that's occurred, while still keeping rates affordable for the most part. But some people are always going to complain about rates, and where that balance gets set, and who sets it will determine, I think, how fast this all occurs.
That actually jogged something in my memory, and Florida Power and Light, their system got flattened by one hurricane. I can't remember which one it was, and they invested a significant amount, billions of dollars, in the hardening of their system. And the next hurricane, it basically, FPL really withstood, they really withstood and had limited outages. And so Linda's right, there are investments, but I do think that it's difficult, and with the regulatory structures that we, and rate cases. You just said that, they will reject them. They reject increases, and that's the problem, and which is why I go to infrastructure bills.
Great, thank you. We have a couple minutes left. Guy?
Well, I can't pass up this opportunity because I know that I was sitting here thinking two of the most intense efforts that I think probably have ever been undertaken in DOE were the National Energy Policy plan that Linda led, and was, I mean, it was really intense, and I know Vito, late Vito Stagliano, was really, he spent countless days and months working on that, and Linda and Melanie, I wasn't there, but I can say from anonymous sources that you led a very intensive effort on the quadrennial energy review. Looking back, I mean, I know we're not far removed from QER. Do you feel that anything endures from those efforts, or does it just, as Kevin said, the next administration comes in, tears it up or rewrites it? I mean, I guess I'm asking you, do you feel like the intensity and the resources that were devoted, I don't want to say we're worth it, but how do you look back on that now?
I meant to look up the numbers before I came here, expecting somebody would ask me that question. And we could only look at the impact and do a scorecard on the first installment of the QER. And I believe 30% of the recommendations were enacted into law. and roughly 30%, and to have things, and another 30% or whatever, the agencies actually did X, Y, and Z. And so when you have 30% of, there must have been 60, 65 recommendations in the first installment, things that get enacted into law with the animosity and acrimony in Congress right now, and the aversion to agreement on law, I think that was pretty spectacular. The FAST Act included provisions to provide additional authorities to both the Secretary of Energy and the President for cyber issues. Those were recommendations coming out of the QER. So I think that in my view, it was worth it. The second installment we rolled out on January 6, 2017, and I haven't done a scorecard on that one, but I think that they do have impact, and I'm sure that Linda feels the same way.
Well, thank you for the question, Doug, because it was certainly a transformative experience in my life, in my professional career, and the opportunity to work with Vito, with Barry McNutt, Kevin Kelly. It was, should have mentioned, one of the problems with energy policy is, of course, the Department of Energy really doesn't have the policy, that many policy levers. They are an interior, on leasing policy, or they're at FERC on regulatory policy. So to get anything done, or their PPA, of course, to get anything done, you have to find a way to coalesce the whole government. And that experience was, I know you haven't been saying QER, but I am proud of that. And I think it was well documented in Vito's book, Policy and Discontent, which I actually shared because with Melanie and her troops, because it has a historical reference as well. But I think it's a terrific book. It is much declined to me, but as I said, it was extraordinary. I do think, the wind production tax credit and the solar investment credit originated in the energy policy after 1992. It's a very little known fact. They weren't particularly successful for a while, but the combination of technology development, changes in economics of other fuels, and starting, with actually when Enron got the wind business and took it over from Exxon, yes. The rest is history, as they say. The changes to the electricity system it was just a case-by-case open access. It was a repeal of PUCA, Public Utility Holding Company Act, restrictions that were limiting the growth of competitive generation. I am very proud of that. I agree with Kevin that but for the Iraq's invasion of Kuwait creating a crisis, we may not have been able to get that legislation across the finish line. But I think what that did, that exercise enabled us to be ready, to have a set of policy measures that have been hammered out administration-wide and introduced in legislation such that when we had an engine, the train was there waiting at the station. We were able to get some things done, but actually, those were just two things. There was a lot more than that. But I think those exercises, and just like Melanie said, some of it will come to pass. Doing the exercise, as I said, was I don't know, $1,000 to transform.
Kevin, did you have anything to add to that?
I have never presided over a transformation in energy policy.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we're past time because I have no more questions. I'm sure you do. But let's all thank you.